So we'll go ahead then and start lecture 1 here. I always like to start very broadly or generally. So some of you guys, right, this is take 2 or round 2 for you guys. So you probably already heard this spiel. Maybe you didn't, hopefully you didn't repress it, right? And so maybe it's going to be a little bit of review. Most of us are new though, right? You haven't had me before. So again, I like to start no matter what philosophy class I'm teaching very broadly, right? And talk about philosophy itself. What is philosophy? I'll give you a historical breakdown, right, to the subject and a categorical breakdown as well. Again, just trying to give us a sense of what we're going to be wrestling with throughout the semester. So start very broadly. And I think I gave the analogy last time that it's kind of like we're on a tour, right? We're going to be on a tour bus touring the land of philosophy. I'm your tour guide. Welcome. Can't wait to get started here, right? And we're not going to spend too long necessarily exploring any particular area of philosophy, right? Instead, we're going to kind of get a sample, a taste of each one, and then move the bus along to the next one, right? So then, but when you discover that you really like, say, epistemology or ethics, for example, is a good example here, right? When you discover how much you really like ethics, well, then you can go study ethics for an entire semester, right, in Philosophy 203. So I'll see you guys there, I guess, in the fall then, right? But so here for Philosophy 100, the idea is we're not going to spend too much time navigating any particular area, right? But instead, kind of get a glimpse of all the different aspects, or a lot of them, right, within the land of philosophy. So that's our strategy here. I do have a couple sort of prefatory remarks here real quick before I get into these. I want to mention, right, there's nothing set in stone or fixed about either one of these, really. Right, if you were to take a different philosophy class with a different instructor or read a different philosophy textbook, you know, these might be broken down a little bit differently. Now, I will say this tends to be pretty uniform or standard, right? So, in other words, the eras themselves, ancient, medieval, modern, contemporary, right? No matter what philosophy you're talking to or what book you're reading, usually you'll hear these 4 eras referenced. But there will be, you know, there's no consensus per se regarding the point at which the medieval era ends and the modern era begins, right? There might be, depending on which philosopher you're talking to, you know, that date could look different. So I just want to acknowledge that from the outset. There's nothing necessarily rigid or set in stone about any of this, okay? Having said that, though, again, this is pretty uniform. You do hear these eras referenced quite a bit, okay? So in terms of what you guys need to know, don't worry so much about the dates, okay? I would know, though, the eras themselves and the sequence, right? So don't worry about the dates, the particular dates where one era started and the next one began, but you should know, like, the order, right? Ancient, medieval, modern, contemporary, okay? And for the most part, we're going to rattle off a host of different philosophers in each of these eras. For the most part, don't worry about knowing which particular philosopher was within which era unless I specify otherwise. And so, for example, these 3 saints, and then Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle from the ancient era, it would behoove you to know, right, that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, maybe you already kind of knew this, right, are ancient philosophers, okay, and that these 3 saints are all medieval philosophers. Other than that, though, I wouldn't necessarily worry about the specific philosophers and which ones belong to which specific era, okay, just FYI. While I'm thinking about it as well, I want to mention that for the most part, for a couple of reasons, we are dabbling pretty much exclusively in the Western tradition of philosophy. Okay? First of all, you know, why? Well, practical reasons. Again, we only have so much time. We can't even cover everything I want to cover in the Western tradition, let alone then opening up the entire Eastern tradition. It would be way too much. Okay? And secondly, I mean, in terms of my own expertise, you know, admittedly, I don't know near as much about the Eastern tradition. Okay? But I wanted to make sure that I mention that because it's not to suggest, right, or demean the Eastern tradition. I don't mean to suggest there's, you know, what's going on in the Eastern tradition isn't as important, or that there's nothing significant happening, right? There certainly is. I'll even reference, I think, on the slide that details the ancient era, I think I even mentioned the Buddha. Right? So there's clearly some very important contributions from the Eastern tradition as well. But we, for better or worse, right, given those reasons, are going to be pretty much exclusively talking about the Western tradition, okay? And so I would make kind of a very similar point regarding the categorical breakdown of philosophy. Okay, our discussion of the categories will be much briefer. But again, the point is, here, right, that there's nothing necessarily fixed about this. Okay, I will say, up until a couple decades ago, this was pretty standard. And so I think I even call it on the slide, once we get there, the traditional or classic, I think it's traditional, is what I call it. But you can call it like the classical or traditional breakdown of the categories of philosophy. And I call it that because, again, up until a couple decades ago, that was pretty much, this was how all the philosophy books, all the philosophers would break it down. But recently, in the past few decades, you have seen this tweaked a little bit. Like, so you'll maybe see a fifth or sixth category added. Like, so for example, philosophy of religion or social and political philosophy or aesthetics, the philosophy of art, might be introduced as their own categories, whereas before those were always subsumed under these other areas. So just FYI, again, want to make sure I acknowledge those points before then diving in here. Okay, so let's take a look then. Like I said, let's start very broadly. This is a philosophy class. Well, what the heck is philosophy? Now, my guess is you probably had sort of a certain connotation associated with philosophy, a general idea of what it is. And it's probably, roughly speaking, you know, akin to what philosophy really is, right? So, I mean, I don't mean to speak for you guys, but presumably, right, you associate philosophy with like deep questions, thinking about the deep stuff, you know, why are we here? What happens when we die, what's really going on, et cetera, right? And philosophy is certainly concerned with those capital T big truths. That's what keeps yours truly lying awake at night, right? Definitely true. But I just wanted to emphasize that in some sense, philosophy is really concerned with the truth in general, whether it's capital T big truths, lowercase t little truths, right? The philosopher is just interested in what the truth is, what is really happening. Of course, again, the big questions certainly is part of that. But also, you know, philosophy is going to train us to analyze all aspects of the truth, including like the lowercase t truths, right? Does my car really need the 17 repairs that the mechanic suggests, right? Philosophers are interested in the truth in all its various shapes and sizes, okay? And so studying philosophy, I would argue, like, because a lot of times we'll get the question, like, where does this get us? Like, what use is this? Well, even if we don't get the answers to the big questions, it's training our minds to think analytically, right? And to approach certain things, right, a certain way. And so maybe it's the case that actually what we'll find is that it'll shine a light on all the things that we don't know, right? It'll make it clear what we don't really know to be the case. So maybe it's kind of like a negative process. So Socratic wisdom, we're going to get to know this idea of Socratic wisdom, this idea that true wisdom or knowledge lies in appreciating everything you don't know. So maybe philosophy is going to help us, right? Maybe it won't illuminate certain answers, but it'll help shed the light on the fact that we don't actually have the answers, right? Whereas some of us seem to think we do until we kind of are made aware of our ignorance, right? So Socrates, as we'll see early on in the course, reluctantly finally agrees that he is the wisest one on earth. Why? Because he's the only one that acknowledges just how much of an idiot he is, right? All he's ever suggested is he knows nothing. Well, that's what puts him one up, because everyone else thinks they know things that they don't. Right? So maybe philosophy, maybe it's the case that we don't get the big answers, but we're still like training our minds, right? We still get kind of that, I kind of put it in terms of negative knowledge, that awareness of all the things we actually don't know, right? One way or another, though, however you want to couch it, right? Philosophy is concerned with shining the light on the truth. Okay? And maybe it's the case that we'll shine a light on all the things we thought we knew, but we don't, right? One way or another, right? We're trying to get a better bearing on what is actually happening, what is true, okay? So going back to, so that's what I'm, again, trying to characterize what philosophy is in general, so hopefully again, that's helpful. The term itself is a Greek word that has two root words, right? Philo, and that's why I put a slash here and kind of indicate that in the word there. So philos, typically translated friend or lover, and then Sophia, wisdom or knowledge. So that sounds pretty fancy. We're all philosophers in here now. Welcome to the club. We're all lovers of wisdom or knowledge or truth, however you want to put it. Okay, so again, that's philosophy in the broadest sense, right? That's what we're up to in here. Okay, so like I said, we're going to turn our attention now then to kind of the historical background for our subject, talk about these different eras in the history of philosophy. So a quick preliminary question. Why even think of the history of philosophy as consisting of these distinct eras. Does anybody think they know why that would be? Okay, so yeah, the suggestion is kind of the experiences and the lives that these philosophers are living is changing, and that's kind of along the right track, because basically what I was going to say is like what is most important or most interesting to the philosophers, or what's front and center in terms of garnering the most philosophical interest, that changes throughout the history of philosophy. And I think it's a result of what you pointed out, right? Probably what's going on in the lives of these philosophers is changing, right, as we progress through the history of philosophy. So again, the general answer, why do we even distinguish there being these distinct eras of philosophy? Because what's most front and center changes. Right? Now, don't get the wrong idea, and don't think that they're ever neglecting any aspect of philosophy at any point, right? So, any guesses as to what's going to stand out in the medieval era before we get there? Religion, right? So, religion and God is going to kind of come to the forefront. Okay. The point I was just mentioning now, though, is that's not to suggest they completely ignored any of these other aspects. Right? All aspects of philosophy are being pursued by someone, right? Some philosopher during every point, right? But the idea is certain elements of philosophy seem to garner more interest, right, at certain times. And so that's why, okay? So a general reason why, again, we divvy up the history of philosophy into these different eras. What are the eras? Here they are, right? Ancient, medieval, modern, and contemporary. Quick listing there. And so what we're going to do is then turn our attention to each of these in a little bit more detail. So starting with the ancient era. So the ancient era, we'll say, begins roughly the 6th century BC with Thales, who's considered the father of philosophy. Now, if you ask me, what happened to my marker? Somehow I lost my marker. If you ask me, when did philosophy start? Oh, no. Here we go. When did philosophy start? Well, when did humans arrive? Okay, I don't know if I gave the spiel on day one, and we're going to get into this. This is actually, in my opinion, one of the more interesting topics that we discuss, and that's like, what are we? Like, what are humans, and what distinguishes us from other animals? A lot of us think that we're significantly different from other animals, but are we? And if so, in what sense? So we're really going to wrestle with that towards the middle and latter portion of the second section of the course. But I bring that up now because one of the things I've always one of the ways I've approached that issue is I always thought that what distinguishes humans from other animals is that we are philosophical in some sense. We're self-conscious. We're reflective, right? Now, I had one student in a different section when I made this point kind of look at me like, how do I really know what's going on in the dog's mind, right? But dogs, for example, I don't know that they're mulling over why there's something and not nothing, or what happens after they die, right? Or what's really happening, right? But that is what's going on with humans, at least sometimes, right? And I think that's literally then one of the defining features of what it means to be human is we do entertain these types of questions. We are self-conscious and reflective, right? So the whole point is, when did philosophy start? Well, when did humans emerge, right? Because I would argue that's when philosophy started. But, academically, usually Thales is the one pointed to in terms of when the Western tradition of philosophy started. And why Thales? Because with him, the suggestion is we turn from, or the ancient thinkers did, they turned from explaining phenomena in exclusively mythological terms usually they turned to what we would call logic or philosophy proper, right? Examining things rationally, right, and defending positions through arguments and so on. With Thales, that's where you first kind of get that. And so that's the impetus then for why Thales is pointed to as kind of being the beginner or the father of philosophy as we know it, okay? So Thales, pretty important figure. We also have, as I mentioned, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So we try to make things as easy as possible. Philosophy is a difficult subject. Let's mitigate that difficulty whenever we can. One of the ways that I like to do that is with helpful acronyms, right? So SPA, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. What's interesting is if you were to poll the average Joe Blow walking down the street, in other words, a non-philosopher, and ask them, can you name a philosopher? Like 99 times out of 100 usually, if they're able to name one, it's going to be Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle. And I've always found that pretty fascinating because these are some of the oldest philosophers as well, right? So, it's interesting to me that the ones that non-philosophers are most familiar with are like the oldest. Now, it does make sense because these guys made huge contributions to the history of philosophy. I see you in 1 second here. They make huge contributions to the history of philosophy, right? So it's not really a surprise that even non-philosophers know these names. And what really stands out about SPA, or Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, is not only did they make these contributions, but they were extremely long-lasting, right? So what happens throughout the history of philosophy is a lot of times somebody will make a contribution, it'll be significant, but then like 2 decades later, someone else comes along the scene and does something slightly better, and then that first person is completely forgotten, more or less. But that doesn't happen with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, right? We're still talking about them 2,000 plus years later. Again, even average everyday people who don't even study philosophy are familiar with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And again, that just speaks to not only the fact that they made these major contributions, but how long-lasting their influence has been. So when you guys become so enamored with philosophy, you're going to want to take other philosophy classes. And so I'll see you in Philosophy 103 next semester, right? Intro to Critical Thinking, a logic and critical thinking course. Half the curriculum, arguably, still stems from what Aristotle introduced 2,000 plus years ago. So again, that just speaks to not only the fact that these guys made these major contributions, but how long-lasting they have been. Did you have a question? Mill, we'll get to Mill. John Stuart Mill is in the 1800s. So push pause on him. We'll meet him here in a couple eras, like 1,500 years. Yeah, stay tuned. Okay, so SPA, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. What's interesting about that order? Anybody know? Exactly, that is the order, right, that they appear on the scene. And so Socrates was Plato's mentor, Plato was Aristotle's mentor. Okay, now I don't know did I mention this already? I don't think I did. So we mentioned why we distinguish all these eras in the first place, right? Because something sort of stands out about each of the eras. Well, what stands out about the ancient era is that nothing stands out, right? So they're kind of the exception, right? What stands out is that they seemed equally interested in everything and that nothing stood out, right? So Aristotle is, again, one I like to point to because he seemingly wrote on everything under the sun. Apparently, supposedly, we only have 20% of Aristotle's original writings that have survived, which is astounding to me. I have all of his writings that have survived at home, and it's like already takes up a bookshelf. So I can't imagine, like, if that's only 20% of his entire writings, like, he must have done nothing but write, I guess. But anyway, the point here was he has books on botany, physics, poetics, Nicomachean ethics, politics, you name it, basically, and he's seemingly written a book on it. So that, again, just speaks to, it's indicative or symbolic of the ancient thinkers in general and how they had seemingly a multifaceted interest in all aspects of philosophy. And another kind of interesting, somewhat parallel theme is that back then in the ancient era, everything was kind of considered a branch of philosophy. So like botany I mentioned, the study of plants, well, that was considered like natural philosophy. And then over time, what ends up happening is you kind of get these aspects of philosophy kind of carved out and distinguished as their own disciplines. So like psychology, most of us familiar with psychology, that wasn't really established as its own discipline until, I want to say, maybe even the 19th century. I think the guy's name was like William Wundt, some German psychologist, kind of officially established as psychology. At least that's the story I remember, right? But the whole point is, like, for a long, long time historically, psychology was really considered philosophy of mind or something like that, right? So, and then over time, right, so everything kind of started as a branch or aspect of philosophy and then kind of gets carved out as its own discipline as we proceed historically. So we mentioned, so the dates, right, 6th century BC, roughly, with the presence of Thales is kind of when we suggest the ancient era began. And we're going to just suggest the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 as a kind of nice point of demarcation for when the ancient era ends and the medieval era begins. Okay, don't worry so much about the date, but we're going to say roughly then. We talked about kind of what stands out. Well, nothing stands out. And we talked about the major players, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. There are other ones that I wanted to mention. I mentioned Thales already. But like Parmenides, he's the one that said all is one. Really interesting philosophy. So, you know, if you think about it enough, he says change and motion have to be illusions. Right? They're illusory. Yeah, he would be in here. Yep. Yeah. Somebody was just mentioning Diogenes as well. But Heraclitus, so kind of like the flip side of Parmenides, he says that all is in flux. There's nothing static or permanent or fixed about reality. He's the one that famously says you can't step into the same river twice. And you're like, well, what's that all about? Here's the Kansas River. Here it is again. I'm jumping in it, or not jumping in it, right? I'm putting a foot in it 1 second apart. Isn't that the same river? Well, what's his point? It's not actually exactly the same, right? Certain water molecules that were right here are now like, it's not much further downstream, but they're a little bit further downstream. And granted, it's ever so minute, but even the banks of the river have eroded ever so slightly in, that 1 second or whatever. So it looks very similar, but it's technically not the exact same. Okay? And so Heraclitus is one that draws our attention to that. All these guys were very influential in the history of philosophy to follow. But like, so for Heraclitus, for example, was very influential on someone like Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. Who else? I mentioned the Buddha, right? So an acknowledgement of the Eastern tradition there, right? So the Buddha came during this ancient era as well. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, mentioned those guys. Any questions on the ancient era? Okay, so then we get our transition into the medieval era. Roughly, we're going to say 476, okay, the fall of the Roman Empire. And then this is going to be a pretty long era in the history of philosophy, almost 1,000 years, you might say. Okay, and we'll just say 1400 is a nice, clear point at which to say the medieval era ends and the modern era begins, okay? So we already referenced earlier kind of what stands out about the medieval era, and that's the God, right? Questions regarding God, philosophy of religion more generally. So let's be honest, most of the time, at least ostensibly, right, all these guys are, and they're mostly guys, right, doing philosophy, or at least ones we hear about during the medieval era. They're not questioning God's existence per se. Now they might have debates and discussions about what the best proof or argument for God's existence is, but a lot of discussion wasn't necessarily about God's existence, but more, what must God be like? Right? Granted, God exists. What is God like? So, God's existence is one sort of type of question, and God's essence then is another kind of aspect of the philosophy of religion, and that received a lot of attention and discussion as well. So one way or another, lots of questions regarding God and more generally the philosophy of religion are, really what stand out when it comes to the medieval era. One theme I like to draw our attention to, as I mentioned, I think that's the third bullet point there on the slide, is you did get a lot, this is a recurring theme, you get a lot of appreciation on the part of the medieval thinkers for the ancient philosophers who preceded them. A lot of admiration. They were usually pretty familiar with, the medieval thinkers were pretty familiar with, well-versed with the ancient philosophers, and you had a lot of admiration. And so some of them are known as being like pretty much scholars when it comes to the ancient thinkers. So for example, a lot of us have heard of Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas. Right? He is very much known as being an Aristotelian, and in fact, when you read Aquinas, he reads a lot like Aristotle. So methodologically, they proceed very similarly. Aquinas is going to use a lot of the same terminology, conceptually proceeds very similarly. So like Aristotle is very fond of talking in terms of telos, teleology, or the idea that things have functions or purposes, right? And Aquinas inherits that same kind of lingo. So that's just another example again of a medieval thinker who kind of marries an ancient philosopher with his own theology. Right? So Aquinas very much known for being influenced heavily by Aristotle, and it shines through in his works. Okay, so I was saying, so along the same lines, right, I was pointing out Aquinas very much influenced by Aristotle. The same is true of Augustine, right? Maybe you guys have heard of St. Augustine or St. Augustine as well, pretty famous name. But he was actually very much influenced by Plato, not Aristotle. So, and so for example, Augustine's famous book is called The Confessions, right? You can see again kind of how Plato very strongly influenced Augustine. So Augustine marrying Plato's thought with his own theology, right? So again, that's a reoccurring trend that you see in a lot of the medieval thinkers. Okay, so in terms of prominent thinkers, a lot of us, even non-philosophers, right, even coming into the class without any exposure to philosophy, probably had heard of these two names. Okay, Aquinas, or maybe one of them. Okay, Aquinas and Augustine, right? Not so much Anselm, he's a little bit more obscure. Now, if you did have a class in philosophy, or more specifically philosophy of religion, maybe you had have some awareness of Anselm. We're actually going to tackle Anselm later in section 3, so we'll get acquainted with his famous ontological argument for God's existence. But these three saints are, by far, at least in my mind, the most famous medieval thinkers. So AAA, you'll notice the acronym there. Hopefully that's helpful for you. Any questions on the medieval era? Okay. So then that brings us to the modern era. We'll say it begins roughly 1400, some point in the early Renaissance period, and then we'll say a nice like kind of line to draw in terms of when the modern era ends and the contemporary era begins is, let's say, 1900. And we'll say more about why this new contemporary era later. But let's go back to the modern era. Why this modern era? I have to be very careful how I portray this, because it can be easy to kind of come away saying like, oh, it's science versus religion. But that's not really, I don't think, accurate. And in fact, ostensibly at least, so on the face of things, almost all these modern thinkers were very religious. Of course, you had to be very careful still, up until the very end of the modern era, what you said, right? Or you could be put to death. So what did they really think? You know, that's always kind of a question in the background, right? What did these people really think versus what did they say, right? But at least ostensibly, almost all of these modern thinkers are definitely believers in God, right? So it would be, I think, misguided to suggest that the debate was between, or the issue was like one of science versus religion. But, okay, and why am I cautioning against that? Well, because you did have, I would say the best way to think of it is a newfound appreciation for knowledge, or what's known as epistemology in philosophy, right? Knowledge-based questions, and what can we be confident about? What even counts as knowledge? To know something, what does that even look like? How do we even know when we know something, right? You do have a greater appreciation for those sorts of issues and questions. A greater concern for like replicating what we're said to know, right? And so maybe some appeals to like what we would call the scientific method, right? You saw these things emerging during this time period. Okay, so in terms of philosophy subjects, we would say M&E, or metaphysics and epistemology, really come to the forefront. These are really drawing the attention of a lot of the philosophers during the modern era. And being the nerd that I am, by the way, I love having, I don't know that love is the right way to put it, but I often will have this internal debate in my mind, like what's the most significant or richest era in philosophy? Was it the modern era or the ancient era? Because they're both extremely important, and they both had seemingly countless different figures that we're all familiar with. So the modern era, right? A whole host of philosophers, and some of whom you've probably heard of. I don't even have some of these guys up on the overhead, right? So like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, those are two that I would put in the modern era that aren't listed. Ayn Rand, towards the end of the 19th century, maybe she might be better construed as a contemporary thinker, but the point is there's a lot of very well-known names that belong to the modern era. Descartes, we're going to get to know Descartes pretty well. He's going to have us questioning everything around us, right, pretty early on in the course. So stay tuned for Descartes. You might have heard of Descartes, right? He's the one that famously suggests, I think, therefore I am. We'll see what he means by that towards the end of the first section. Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned, did I mention this? Did I not make this point about Pythagoras? I thought so, right? No, I didn't. It was a 9:30 class that I mentioned. Yeah, so for whatever reason, there does seem to be this strong correlation, and I'm glad you mentioned this, between philosophers and doing philosophy and math, for whatever reason. This is actually true of myself. I was pretty good at math, and so when it was time to go to undergrad, it was like my big debate was between philosophy and engineering / math, which way to go. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. Descartes is almost as famous as being a mathematician, and for good reason. He was a very good mathematician. Leibniz is another one. Pythagoras, which did I not mention Pythagoras on that previous screen? Whoops, he's on there, right? Yeah, he's on there. I guess I just didn't mention him. But yeah, Pythagoras, right? Another great example of a philosopher who most of us don't think of Pythagoras anymore as really being a philosopher. We know him as being a mathematician, right? The Pythagorean theorem: a squared plus b squared equals z cubed, or no, c squared. That's right. Okay. But yeah, Descartes. Leibniz is another one that comes to mind. Bertrand Russell, contemporary philosopher. These guys were all really good at math too. So I don't know what that means, what that's all about, but it's definitely something you'll pick up on, is that there seems to be a correlation between philosophy and math aptitude. Anyway, so Descartes, David Hume, we're going to get to know David Hume. He's probably a lesser known name outside of philosophical circles, but very well known by philosophers and the penultimate skeptic. So we're going to see him in a lot of skeptical contexts throughout the semester. Immanuel Kant, I definitely want to flag his name. Okay, so, right, he's one where, look, you ask the average everyday person, they're going to name a philosopher. They're going to name Socrates, Plato, Aristotle for good reason. Those guys all belong in the top tier of philosophers, right? So if we were going to rank philosophers in terms of their significance and influence, these guys deservedly belong into tier 1. Okay, there's a reason why even non-philosophers to this day know Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. My point here, though, is if you were to ask academic philosophers who else belongs in tier 1, they're absolutely going to put Immanuel Kant in tier 1. Whether they're lovers or haters, even the haters of Kant, and to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of Kant myself, even the haters are going to acknowledge a debt of gratitude to Kant, acknowledge his huge contributions, ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, and seemingly every aspect of philosophy. So Kant, we're going to become acquainted with him at various points in the semester. Somebody was mentioning Mill. Yeah, so here we are, right? We encounter Mill. He's in the 19th century. Nietzsche, 1844, died in 1900, so he's at the very end of the modern era as well. One very important point. So at the top of the slide, right? And this is very important because you will often, I mentioned this earlier, right? We do have these labels referenced. So when you're reading a journal article or an introduction to a certain section, they're going to reference the contemporary era of philosophy. Or oftentimes you will hear especially the modern era of philosophy referenced, okay? So it's important to know, if somebody's like, I'm a big fan of the modern philosopher Billy Willie or whatever. Don't be Googling, well, when's Billy Willie's next presentation? Because he's been dead for at least 100 plus years, right? So modern, the whole point is, modern doesn't mean now, right? For these philosophy eras, right? Now is the contemporary. Okay, so probably should have started with that, but that's the modern era. Questions, comments, concerns? Makes perfect sense? Okay. I'll assume an absolutely perfect understanding of everything. All right. That brings us to the contemporary era. Y'all are contemporary philosophers. Congratulations. Welcome to the club. Okay, so we're going to, basically, contemporary era philosophy is synonymous with 21st and 20th century philosophy. So anything, we're going to say 1900 onwards. Okay. Well, why this new era? Well, it has to do with this schism, this division, this feud that is emerging leading into the 20th century. So like heading into 1900, kind of right before the turn of the century, you had this feud that was emerging, this schism within philosophy, and it more or less boils over right at the turn of the century. And so that's kind of the impetus then for us suggesting that a new era of philosophy began, right? Well, what is this division? What is this schism all about? What are these two camps or traditions fighting over? And for better or worse, by the way, it's still palpable, just as palpable, still as influential, this division, to this day as it was when it first erupted 100 plus years ago, right? So when you guys realize how enamored you become with philosophy towards the middle and the end of the semester, you're going to be like, man, maybe I really want to go study this and get a degree in it. Well, this is actually going to affect perhaps where you're going to move to go study then, because as I mentioned here, there is a geographical correlation too, right? So again, let's go back though. What is this feud all about? Well, actually, it gets really to the heart of philosophy itself. It's a debate about what even the essence of philosophy is and what philosophy should look like in terms of the methodology. Like, how should we go about doing philosophy? What's most imperative or important, right? So the really fundamental disagreements is kind of what I was getting at here, right? So let me try to characterize the disagreement here. So the analytics, and if we had an analytic philosopher in here, and conversely, if we had a continental philosopher, I don't subscribe to either. I don't label myself as either. They're probably going to disagree with some of these characterizations, but I'm just trying to give you a rough idea of what each of these kind of camps thinks. Okay, so the analytic camp is roughly, right, a camp that suggests, look, these so-called problems in philosophy, these significant philosophical problems that we think we have, really they're overstated. And in fact, if we just reflect enough, what we will figure out is that really we're the cause of most of these so-called philosophical problems. That really, if we just became better thinkers and speakers, right, the issues arise because we have such crappy thinking and speaking. So if we just became better thinkers and speakers, we would see these so-called problems of philosophy sort of dissipate or disappear entirely. And so what do we need to do? Right, if the problem is not thinking and speaking well enough, well, what's their focus and emphasis going to be on then? Better thinking and speaking. So what does that mean? Language and logic, right? Logic is all about good thinking, right? And trying to have it and eliminating the bad thinking. Right? So no surprise then, right? If they think the root of all problems in philosophy, or for the most part, right, it boils down to our inability to think and speak clearly, well then to rectify those problems, what do we need to do? Become better thinkers and speakers. Take some logic classes. So I'll see you guys all in Philosophy 103 next semester. Right? Become better speakers, communicators, so maybe some English classes, or a lot of philosophy classes, right? Because we become better writers in philosophy, right? So a huge emphasis on language and logic. Right? Now the Continentals, they're like, well, hold up, nuh-uh. It doesn't matter how good we become at speaking and thinking, there are still going to be these significant, substantial philosophical problems that don't disappear. So it doesn't matter what degree we perfect our thinking and speaking, you're never going to be able to tell me why there's something and not nothing. What happens when we die? What's really going on? Right? There are these significant philosophical problems that no degree of perfecting our language and thinking is going to eliminate, right? So not that they dismiss the import or significance of language and logic, right? But the suggestion is, look, it's not the end-all, be-all, right? Of all of it's not going to solve all of our philosophy problems, like these guys suggest. Okay, so that again, in fairness to both those camps, all right, that's just a very rough, crude kind of characterization of each of them. I'm sure they would have problems with how I describe them. But hopefully that gives you, again, a general sort of idea. There's a lot of derision, a lot of animosity between these two camps, which is, like I mentioned earlier, still alive to this day. I'll give you relay a story here in a moment. It kind of speaks to that from my own personal experience. But you're constantly getting back and forth here. So the analytics, say, of the Continentals, their heads are in the clouds. They're too mystical. You never know what the hell they're really talking about, right? They need to be more grounded. And the Continentals will say of the analytics, they're cold-hearted, logic-chopping machines with no true appreciation of the human condition, right, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of back and forth. Oh, by the way, so one school of thought that you might have heard of that's affiliated or associated with the Continental Tradition would be existentialism, okay? So again, a lot of back and forth, a lot of animosity. I've never been a fan of this schism. I don't think it does us any good, but it doesn't matter what I think, it's still there, right? And it definitely impacts things. So you might remember me saying that I have, coincidentally, a master's degree and a PhD in philosophy, one of which was at Boston College. The master's degree and the PhD is right down the road at KU. Well, what's interesting is, right, let me back up. So when you discover you want to study philosophy, right, and go to grad school for it, you're going to have to pick a team, more or less. Why? Because, for better or worse, the analytic tradition is really dominant in the United States and England, right? So if that's your team, well, stay put, right? And maybe you can get enrolled in the KU's PhD program right down the road, right? But if you really find yourself liking, some existentialists or whatever, well then you're probably going somewhere else in Europe, especially France and Germany are like the hotbeds of the Continental Tradition, right? So there is this geographical correlation then, right? So you're going to have to pick a team, unfortunately, or which one you kind of resonates with you most, and then that's probably going to dictate where you're studying. Now, having said that, it's been a while since I've actually looked into this, at least like a decade. But I would say roughly, out of all the college philosophy departments in the United States, 90% of them are going to be associated with the analytic tradition, and only 10% are going to be associated with the Continental camp. Okay, so let's say, and again, it's been a while since I've looked into this. Let's say that there's 300 departments of philosophy in colleges and universities in the United States. That means only at most 30 are going to be associated with the Continental camp. The other 270 plus are going to be analytic. Well, as it just so happens to be the case, Boston College is very much associated with the Continental Tradition. And then KU, where I went for my PhD, right, is the complete opposite. It's about as analytic as it gets. And so I witnessed firsthand just how different these traditions were, right? The teachers, how they taught classes was very, very much different. Their writing is very different, right? So if you were to read a book authored by one of the philosophers or the professors at Boston College, it's going to read totally different than a book or an article published by one of the KU instructors. Just a quick example, this makes sense, right, given what the analytics emphasize, as we mentioned earlier, logic, right? If you're going to read a journal article by one of the instructors down the road at KU, it's probably going to be, I don't know about littered, but it's going to have a lot of logical symbolism in there, a lot of logical notation, right? Whereas if you read an article by a continental philosopher, that's a lot less likely to be the case. You're going to see a lot less like stuff written in logical notation, for example. Okay, so again, for better or worse, in my mind, for the worst, right? I don't know what good any of this has done for philosophy. But regardless, right, it is every bit as tangible, appreciable, impactful to this day as it was when it first kind of erupted, this division. So again, that is the impetus for us suggesting there's this new era, call it the contemporary era, which is more or less synonymous with, again, 21st and 20th century philosophy. So we have some pretty well-known, famous names. Jean-Paul Sartre, which some of you have probably heard of. He's oftentimes associated with existentialism, even though he himself hated that label. Bertrand Russell, we're going to get to be familiar with Russell here early on in the semester. So we'll get to know him. Ludwig Wittgenstein was actually Russell's pupil for a little bit. He's a little bit lesser known outside of philosophy. Heidegger, Camus, some of us might be familiar with Camus, wrote The Myth of Sisyphus and a bunch of pretty famous novels. I actually always kind of got into Camus and his, I would call it like philosophical fiction or philosophical novels. Like The Stranger, that one always got stranger every time I read it. I'm not sure that I was ever able to make any sense of it, but The Stranger, The Plague, The Rebel, some of his novels, but pretty good novelists. Derrida, Quine, we'll get to know, or we'll encounter Quine a little bit in the epistemology section. Anyway, some of the thinkers that are most notable thinkers of the contemporary era. Any questions on the contemporary era of philosophy? I think I mentioned everything I wanted to. Or really any questions about the history of philosophy in general? Okay. Well, let's move on to a much briefer categorical breakdown of philosophy, and then I'll let you guys reflect a little bit in your reflection groups. So, as I mentioned, nothing's set in stone here, although I would say up until like a couple decades ago, this was pretty much the standard breakdown. So I call it the traditional kind of categorical breakdown. Right, we have epistemology, or anything like kind of knowledge related. That's known as epistemology. So kind of a fancy word for us now, but this will be like second nature this term. Because so after our introduction here at the first part of this first section, we'll move into epistemology at the end of this first section. Right, so we're going to be talking about, rationalism versus empiricism. So that's a famous debate about how we get our knowledge. So assuming we have knowledge, how did we get it? Is experience required for all knowledge, as the empiricists like Locke suggest? Or do we come pre-programmed, if you will, kind of knowing certain things, right? Is experience not required for all knowledge, as some of the rationalists like Descartes will say, right? So that's just one example of a debate within epistemology. So how do we get the knowledge we have? Do we even have any knowledge? What even is knowledge? What does it mean to even know something? That might seem like, well, duh, it's just me, well, what is it, right? So once you start, it might seem like it's pretty obvious, but the second you start kind of like, well, what is it? You'll realize it's a lot trickier to kind of get a handle on, well, what exactly it actually means to know something than you might originally think. Okay, so we'll talk about, Plato's traditional classic notion that knowledge is true, justified belief, right? It has these three criteria. We'll talk about that. That's been widely accepted, but even that, right, has been sort of had some issues illuminated with respect to it. So what does it even mean to know something? We can't even settle upon a definition of that. But all these types of questions, lines of questioning, that's what we mean by epistemology. Metaphysics is like what's real, what exists. Think like the Matrix type stuff. Dreaming, like how do I know, like Descartes' going to ask this, right? How do I know that I'm not really how do I know I'm not dreaming right now? Because we've all had really vivid dreams, right? We're familiar with this. To the point where we're sweating and then we wake up and we're like, oh my God, thank God that wasn't real, right? You guys ever woken up, but you're actually still in the dream? You didn't know it, because then you wake up again, right? So that's where it gets really trippy, like dreaming within a dream. The bottom line, though, is how do we really know that we're actually really awake, right? Because within our dreams, we feel like we do right now. Like, oh, this is obviously real. Well, then we wake up, you know? So we had the exact same mentality when we're dreaming as we do right now. So how do we know we're not dreaming right now? Right? Anyway, all of that is kind of what we mean by metaphysics. The whole idea of thought, right? We have these thoughts. Are those material? Right? So this notion of a mind that has thoughts, right? What are thoughts? Are they material? Are they just, as the materialist or physicalist is going to say, are they just neurons firing in certain ways? A reflection or manifestation of certain regions in the brain working in certain ways, right? Is that what thought is? It's just another material phenomenon? Or is it something like the dualists are going to suggest that, hey, it seems to be indicative of some other distinct type of substance or existence. It's not material. It's because, after all, material stuff seems like it's public, right? We can all see it, taste it, feel it, etc., right? Whereas, fortunately, my thoughts aren't exactly public in the same manner. Fortunately, you guys don't know what's going on up here, right? There seems to be something different about thoughts versus like other material stuff. So are they really material? Okay, we're going to attack that question too, right, in section 2 of the course. All of that stuff is kind of metaphysics, right? So metaphysics and epistemology very much intertwined, right? If you think about it, when you say something about what we can know, you're at least implying something about what exists, metaphysics, to be known, right? And then conversely, whenever you're saying something about metaphysics, what exists, you're at least implying something about what we can know, right? So these are very much intertwined, but hopefully you can see how they're still distinct kind of interests and endeavors. One's interested in knowledge, the other's interested in what exists, what's really happening, and how many types of substance are there, et cetera. Okay. Then we have logic, and we're going to spend a little bit of time in the next lecture, because no matter what you're studying in philosophy, right, you're after the truth. Well, how do you get to the truth? Logic, right? That is the toolbox of the philosopher. That is the method. Right? Logic shines a light on the truth, or at least that's, kind of how we would characterize it. Right? It's spelling out what good, sound reasoning or arguments will look like. Okay? And so we want to find those in these various philosophical issues. Which ones are the most convincing of these arguments? Okay? So that's why we want to be somewhat acquainted with logic itself. Then know what an argument is. Know whether arguments are any good. Right? So that's why we're going to spend some time. Granted, this isn't a logic class. We're going to spend a little bit of time in lecture 2 on logic. And then finally, arguably the category or aspect of philosophy that most of you were probably most intuitively familiar with, ethics, right? We're all familiar with this notion of right and wrong, good and evil. Some of you have even taken my 203 ethics class, right? So ethics is concerned with those notions. Like, most of us in here are not moral skeptics. We believe that there is such a thing as morality, right? Well, how do we figure that out? How do we know there is such a thing as morality? And what serves as our moral compass, right? Or what should we look to for moral guidance in figuring out moral decisions? Right? What should serve as the moral foundation? Okay, that's what ethics is concerned with. And so when you figure out, oh, I really like this ethics stuff when we talk about it at the beginning of section 3, I'll see you next semester in Philosophy 203 then, except for... do you guys have any questions on any of the categories? Aspects of philosophy? Anything we talked about for that matter? Nobody? Okay, so at the end of each lecture, I like to give you guys, it'll depend, sometimes we might not have time, but time permitting, usually we will. I'll give you guys a little bit of time to, in groups, just with the people right around you, kind of mull over some related topics and questions, right? So first one, initial impressions. You guys probably had something associated with philosophy coming into class. How well does that actually parallel or map up with what you've discovered philosophy is? Right? And what about your philosophical habits? How philosophical are you? Are you the type like yours truly who lies awake at night losing sleep because you can't figure out what's really going on and why there's something and not nothing? Or are you like my wife who's like, where does any of this get us? Doesn't seem like we ever get any answers. I don't see the point, blah, 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 right? Where are you at on that spectrum? Interest areas. What are you looking forward to studying, right? So anything in particular now that we've kind of given a preview of these different topics and we've seen our schedule, is there anything in particular you're looking forward to? And then I like this thought experiment. If you could ask any one question, and it doesn't necessarily even have to be big. It could just be like, who's going to win the World Series, I guess. Maybe that is big if you can win like $1 billion on a bet or something. But right, any question, big, small, teeny tiny, gigantic, whatever size the question is. If you could have any question with a guaranteed answer, then what question would you ask? Okay, so go ahead and break up into your groups and mull this over, and hopefully I'll hear some enthusiasm in these discussions, and we will try to reconvene. That is like a couple minutes fast, by the way. So we'll reconvene briefly and share our answers, and I guess I'll have to let you guys go because we're almost out of time. But